She didn't ask for his name. She didn't ask for his ticket. She just slapped his hand in front of everyone and ordered him to the back, because in her eyes, a young black man couldn't possibly belong in seat 2A. Jalen Carter stepped onto the plane with the same quiet confidence he carried everywhere, steady steps, calm eyes, and the kind of presence that didn't ask to be noticed. He didn't look like someone trying to prove anything. At 18, he had already learned that being seen too much could become a problem, especially when you were a young black man alone, dressed in a hoodie and jeans. But this was a milestone. His first solo trip. First class. A surprise gift from his mother, who insisted he fly in comfort on his way to Torrey University out east. So here he was, headphones around his neck, a clean boarding pass in hand, and a worn paperback tucked under his arm. The first-class cabin had that polished silence, leather seats, soft lighting, passengers already leaning back with earbuds in, not expecting anything to disrupt their morning. Jalen found his seat, 2A. A window seat, just like he liked. He placed his bag in the overhead bin, sat down, adjusted his headphones around his neck, and cracked open his book. No one said a word. No one even looked at him twice. Until she walked in. Margot, the lead flight attendant, moved down the aisle with crisp efficiency. Her navy blue uniform was ironed to perfection, her blonde hair pulled back into a bun so tight it barely moved. She smiled at the older couple in 1B and 1C, gave a nod to the man reading the Wall Street Journal in 2C, and then her eyes landed on Jalen. And everything about her changed. Her step faltered. Her smile disappeared. She tilted her head and stopped beside him. "Excuse me," she said, loud enough for a few heads to turn. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Jalen looked up, polite but puzzled. "Yes, ma'am." 2A, her eyes narrowed. "Can I see your ticket?" He nodded and pulled it from his pocket, offering it to her calmly. She snatched it with quick fingers, eyes scanning it, then scanning him again. "This is a first-class ticket," she said slowly. "Yes, ma'am," Jalen answered, his voice measured. "And you're flying alone?" "Yes." Margot blinked. "So, no parents traveling with you?" He raised an eyebrow slightly. "I'm 18. She folded her arms. "Well, I think there's been a mistake. You need to head back to economy." Jalen sat still. "I think this is my seat." Her jaw tightened. "You're holding up the boarding process, young man. I don't know how you got this ticket, but this is first class. You need to move." Still calm, Jalen said, "I'm not moving. This is my assigned seat." That's when it happened. With one hand, she reached for the phone resting on the armrest. In doing so, she smacked his hand with enough force to make a loud slap echo in the cabin. Several passengers flinched. A woman 2 rows back gasped. A man across the aisle pretended to adjust his tray table, but his eyes were locked on the scene. No one said anything. No one stood. Jalen froze, not from pain, but from the disbelief that she'd just done that. Slapped his hand like he was a child. Like he was a problem. He stood up slowly, picked up his backpack, and walked down the aisle without a word. The silence in the cabin was heavy, stifling. Everyone had seen it. Everyone had heard it. And no one did a damn thing. Jalen found an empty seat in the very back of the plane. It was tight, one armrest was loose, and it smelled faintly of old coffee. He sat down, took a deep breath, and pulled his phone from his lap. His hands didn't shake. He didn't cry. He just typed a message. "She slapped my hand and sent me to the back. I'm in economy now." He hit send. He looked out the window. The tarmac stretched ahead like nothing had happened. But everything had. Back in first class, the plane continued boarding. Margot returned to the galley, poured herself a cup of coffee, and gave herself a small, self-satisfied smirk. She thought she'd handled it. Thought she'd kept order in her precious first-class cabin. Her gut had told her something was off about that boy. He didn't look. like someone who belonged in 2A. And she trusted that instinct, an instinct trained by years of assumptions. She didn't know who had just quietly exited that seat. Didn't know that Jalen's mother, Celeste Carter, sat on the board of directors for the very airline they worked for. Didn't know that Celeste had personally helped shape the company's diversity and ethics policy after 3 years of fighting for systemic reform. All she saw was a teenager in a hoodie. And all she did was act like she had the right to judge. Jalen sat still in his economy seat. He didn't cry. He didn't text again. He just waited. It had been less than 2 minutes since he'd sent the message. And he knew his mother. She didn't yell. She didn't storm into rooms. She called. And when she called, people moved. In a sleek office building 5 states away, Celeste Carter read the message with narrowed eyes. She didn't blink. She didn't speak. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. "Yes," she said calmly, "I need an urgent review of Flight 487. First Class Seat 2A. My son was assaulted and removed without cause. Lock the flight at the gate. No one moves until I say so." The man on the other end didn't hesitate. Understood. Back at the gate, the plane's scheduled pushback was suddenly paused. The jet bridge didn't move. The pilot received a notification marked executive hold, an extremely rare command. Margot didn't notice at first. She was still basking in her own authority. But when she got the call to report to the cockpit, her hand froze mid-pour. The voice was neutral but clipped. "Margot, report to the flight deck immediately." Something in her stomach twisted. She didn't know yet, but the weight of consequences had already started shifting. And in seat 34B, Jalen Carter sat silent, still watching the tarmac, still unreadable. But he knew. This wasn't over. Not even close. Margot's hand trembled slightly as she placed the half-full coffee cup on the galley counter. Something was wrong. The flight was supposed to have pushed back by now, but it hadn't. She'd heard the subtle shift in the captain's voice over the intercom, the clipped edge beneath his normally smooth tone. Then came the call, "Margot, please report to the cockpit." Her chest tightened. She smoothed the front of her uniform, adjusted her bun with shaking fingers, and made her way forward past rows of passengers who had already begun to sense the unease in the air. A few of them watched her. Some whispered. Most pretended to be immersed in phones or travel magazines. But the energy had shifted, and she could feel it in every step. When she reached the cockpit, the door was already cracked open. Captain Delgado, a man known for his calm demeanor and sharp professionalism, stood with one hand on the back of the co-pilot's seat and the other resting on a control panel. His expression was unreadable. "Come in," he said without looking at her. She stepped in, the door closing behind her with a soft click that sounded far too final. A screen beside the radio display flickered to life, and on it appeared the face of Harold Vance, Director of Passenger Relations for the entire airline. His suit was crisp, his eyes sharper. "Margot," he said without preamble, "I need to speak with you about a passenger in seat 2A. Her stomach dropped. "Yes, sir," she said, trying to maintain her composure. There was a misunderstanding. A young man was mistakenly seated in, "Not mistakenly," Harold interrupted, his voice like ice. "His name is Jalen Carter." And he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Margot blinked. "Sir, he didn't look like—" "Stop," Harold said firmly. "You assumed, based on appearance, that he didn't belong. You didn't check the manifest. You didn't verify anything beyond your own bias. That boy is Jalen Carter. His mother is Celeste Carter, civil rights attorney, and a sitting board member of this airline." The silence that followed was crushing. "We've received a direct call from Ms. Carter," Captain Delgado added. "She's requested an immediate executive review. Effective now, this flight is being held at the gate." Margot could barely breathe. "I didn't know," she whispered. "No," Harold replied, "you didn't. And now you're going to fix it. You will apologize to Mr. Carter publicly." You will escort him back to his seat in first class. And then you will return to this cockpit and await further instructions." Her mouth opened, but no sound came. Harold's face didn't soften. "You humiliated the wrong passenger, Margot. And now you're going to own that mistake." She nodded stiffly and turned to leave, each step heavier than the last. The cockpit door opened again, but this time, all eyes turned to her. She walked back down the aisle, no longer with that commanding air she wore like armor, but with the weight of consequences pressing into her spine. She passed rows of passengers who now knew something serious had happened. Some stared openly. Others avoided her gaze. In the very last row of economy, Jalen sat by the window, his phone in his hand, earbuds resting in his lap. He didn't look up when she arrived. She stood there for a long moment before clearing her throat. Her voice had none of the authority it carried earlier. "Mr. Carter," she said quietly, "there's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to your original seat in first class." Jalen didn't answer right away. He let the words hang in the air between them. The hum of the engines was the only sound. Passengers nearby leaned forward slightly, phones half-raised, waiting. Finally, he turned his head and looked at her. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp. "A misunderstanding?" he asked. Margot gave a tight, nervous nod. "I misread the situation." "No," Jalen said evenly. "You misread me." She swallowed hard. "It wasn't personal." "It was personal. The moment you decided I didn't belong," he replied. "You didn't ask anyone else for their ticket. Just me." She couldn't respond. She didn't have an excuse that would hold. Jalen stood slowly, slid his phone into his pocket, and adjusted the strap on his backpack. "I'll go back," he said, "but not because you told me to. Because it's my seat." That line traveled down the aisle like a current. Everyone heard it. Everyone felt it. And not a single person looked away now. Margot nodded, her face pale, and turned to walk back. Jalen followed, moving with the same steady calm he'd walked with hours earlier. But this time, people saw him. Not just a teenager. Not just a passenger in a hoodie. Someone with weight. With presence. With a voice that didn't need to be loud to be heard. He reached 2A and took his seat. He placed his book on his lap, not opening it, but resting his hands on the cover. Margot stood beside him awkwardly. "If there's anything you need," she murmured, "please let me know." He didn't look up. "You've done enough." She turned and walked back down the aisle. Passengers whispered behind raised hands. A man in row 3 looked visibly uncomfortable. A woman across the aisle gave Jalen a quiet nod of respect. The curtain separating first class from economy remained open now, like a reminder that everyone had seen what happened. Jalen leaned back, eyes on the ceiling for a moment, before closing them slowly. His breathing was steady. He wasn't thinking about revenge. He wasn't thinking about punishment. He was thinking about the silence, how no one had spoken up. How many eyes had looked away. And how one apology, delivered out of obligation, didn't erase the damage of being publicly reduced to a stereotype. In the galley, Margot stood alone. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter. Her breath came shallow. She had said the words they told her to say. She had walked the boy back to his seat. But it hadn't undone the slap. It hadn't erased the judgment in her voice, or the silence of the people who let it happen. This wasn't just about a mistake. It was about a choice. And the consequences of that choice were only beginning to surface. Jalen sat in seat 2A, back straight, hands resting on the cover of his unopened book. He hadn't moved since Margot returned to the galley. The hum of the engines was steady now, the kind of background noise that made most people feel comfortable, but to Jalen, it was a reminder that this flight hadn't taken off because of turbulence in the air, but because of one on the ground. Margot's apology still rang hollow in his ears. Not because of what she said, but because of what she hadn't. It wasn't an admission. It was a performance. Something rehearsed and delivered under pressure. And yet, the silence around him had changed. People who had once looked through him now stole glances when they thought he wasn't looking. Their phones were tucked away, but their thoughts weren't. They had seen him walk the aisle twice, once in shame, once in quiet vindication. And that memory was still unraveling in real time. In the back of the plane, Naomi, the youngest flight attendant on the crew, stood near the galley door, arms crossed, eyes distant. She had watched the entire incident unfold, the confrontation, the slap, the silence. She had done nothing then, but the weight of her own stillness was catching up. She picked up her tablet, opened the crew reporting app, and began typing slowly, deliberately. Incident summary: Passenger 2A removed from first class by flight lead without proper verification. Escalation included physical contact. Passenger compliant. Public apology issued after executive order. Recommend formal review. She stared at the words for a moment, then hit send. It wasn't just a report. It was the first time she had ever filed something like that against a fellow crew member. And it felt necessary. At 35,000 feet, the flight was calm, but only on the surface. In the cabin, conversations resumed in whispers. 2 rows ahead, a businessman in a gray blazer whispered to the woman beside him, "That kid, he's someone important, right?" She nodded. "Did you hear? His mom's on the airline board." "No wonder she came back to apologize," he said, guilt flickering in his tone. "I should have said something. We all should have." Jalen hadn't said a word since returning to his seat, but his silence had changed from passive to powerful. He didn't need to raise his voice. The truth had already spoken for him. And now, it was speaking to more people than he could count. Somewhere in the middle of the plane, a young woman refreshed her social feed. A blurry photo taken during the incident was already circulating, Margot standing over Jalen, her face tense, his calm. A caption beneath it read, "First class ticket. Still questioned. Still removed. Still slapped. Because he didn't look like he belonged." Comments were already flooding in. "He handled that better than I ever could." This is exactly why representation matters. The silence of the other passengers speaks volumes. Jalen's phone buzzed in his lap. He glanced down. A new message from his mother: "Footage is going viral. Legal's aware. You did the right thing staying calm. We're handling the rest." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. He knew she meant it. And he also knew this wasn't just about him anymore. In the cockpit, Captain Delgado received a transmission through his headset. "Corporate is initiating formal suspension protocol. Flight staff will be notified upon landing. Press inquiries expected. Internal statement in draft." He exhaled through his nose, quietly, and looked out at the horizon. In his decades of flying, he'd seen weather delays, emergency landings, even passenger outbursts. But he had never seen an entire flight change direction, not in the air, but in meaning. This wasn't a routine journey anymore. It was a moment. And it would follow every person on board long after the wheels touched down. Margot sat in the jump seat near the galley, her hands folded tightly, her eyes locked on the floor. She had served thousands of flights. Believed she was good at reading people. Trusted her instincts. But today, those instincts had betrayed her. She hadn't just misjudged a passenger. She had become the example. And now she was the reason a senior legal executive, a board member, and a plane full of strangers were all reevaluating what belonging looks like. Naomi passed through the first-class cabin, offering drinks again. Her steps were slower, more deliberate now. When she reached Jalen's seat, she paused. "Can I get you anything?" He looked up briefly. "Just water." She poured it without another word and handed it to him. But before walking away, she said softly, "You didn't deserve that. I just wanted to say it." He nodded. "Thank you." Behind her, another passenger finally spoke up, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a firm voice that carried. What happened to you, he said, looking at Jalen, was wrong. I saw it, and I said nothing. That's on me. Jalen turned to him. Why didn't you? The man hesitated. Because I wasn't sure it was my place. And I didn't think it would get that far. Jalen didn't smile. That's the problem. It always gets that far when no one speaks up. The man nodded slowly. You're right. I won't be quiet next time. Good, Jalen said. Make sure there isn't a next time. The words landed like a quiet ripple. Conversations paused. Heads turned. A woman a few seats away gave a soft, almost imperceptible nod. People were starting to understand. In the galley, Margot stared at her folded hands until the in-flight phone rang again. She picked it up. Yes? Margot, said the captain, corporate has made their decision. You will be removed from active duty after landing. An airline official is meeting the flight at the gate. You'll be debriefed before exiting. Her breath hitched. Understood, she said quietly, voice tight. Naomi stood a few feet away and heard every word. She said nothing. The silence said it all. As the plane began its descent, the intercom crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain's voice rang out, we're beginning our final approach. Please fasten seatbelts and ensure all items are secured. The message was standard. But the energy in the cabin was anything but. No one was talking about travel plans. No one was planning their ride home. They were still thinking about seat 2A. Jalen fastened his belt and looked out the window. The ground was coming closer. But his mind wasn't on the runway. It was on the shift that had already taken place. The faces of those around him told the story. Not pity. Not fear. Awareness. And for the first time, he felt that was enough. The wheels touched down with a soft thud. The plane slowed, coasting to a gate. Passengers sat in unusual silence, eyes flicking toward the galley, toward Jalen, toward the curtain still pulled open. The seatbelt sign dinged off. But no one rushed to the aisle. No one scrambled for bags. Row by row, they rose, past Jalen, and some offered nods. Some said thank you. Others just met his eyes and held them for a beat longer than they normally would. And he saw it. They understood now. Margot was the last to rise. The main door opened, and two people in navy suits were waiting just outside the jet bridge, one with a clipboard, the other with a corporate badge. They said nothing. Margot stepped off the plane quietly. The door closed behind her with a hush that felt more like judgment than air pressure. Naomi lingered near the cockpit as the last passengers exited. Jalen remained seated, watching them go. He didn't need to be first. He didn't need attention. He just needed them to remember. Naomi walked toward him and said gently, "They're all off. You're clear to go." Jalen stood, shouldered his bag, and paused. "Thanks for seeing it. Next time," she said, "I'll say something sooner." That's how change starts. He stepped off the plane not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as a reminder. That power doesn't always come with noise. And truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it just sits in seat 2A and waits for the world to notice. There's a moment in every story when silence speaks louder than words. In Jalen Carter's case, it wasn't a raised voice or a heated confrontation that changed the atmosphere of that flight. It was stillness, composure, and the quiet resolve to let the truth rise on its own. This story reminds us that injustice doesn't always look like shouting or fighting. It often begins in subtle moments. A glance. A question. A seat that someone assumes you don't deserve. And when no one stands up, that silence becomes permission. That's why it's so important that we not only see these moments but respond to them. Jalen didn't fight fire with fire. He didn't yell or demand special treatment. He didn't need to. What he showed us is the strength of integrity, the kind that says, "I belong. And I won't let you tell me otherwise." His quiet dignity exposed a system built on unchecked assumptions, and in doing so, he challenged every person watching to reflect on their own silence. But let's be clear, Jalen shouldn't have had to be calm in the face of humiliation. He shouldn't have had to carry the burden of dignity when others failed to carry their courage. This story is not about glorifying composure in the face of bias. It's about making sure fewer people ever have to endure what he did in the first place. So what's the lesson? When you see something wrong, don't wait to see how far it goes, speak up. Challenge the moment, even if your voice shakes. Your discomfort is temporary. Their dignity is not. And for those of us who wear uniforms, who hold authority, who represent institutions, never forget that your judgment can shape someone's experience in ways you'll never fully understand. Treat every person as if they belong. Because they do. To our listeners and supporters of U.S. Heartwarming Story, thank you. Thank you for choosing stories that hold a mirror to society and ask the hard questions. Thank you for believing that even quiet moments can spark change. If this story moved you, I encourage you to share it, talk about it, and reflect on it. Let's keep these conversations alive, not just online, but in boardrooms, classrooms, and every seat we occupy. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to speak the loudest. It's to stand your ground when everyone else stays seated.